Okay, hello and welcome to this video on translating English into propositional logic. My name is Dr. Richard Brown, and this video is primarily for my HUP 112 class that I teach at LaGuardia Community College. In this class, we use the textbook written by Patrick Hurley called Logic the Essentials, which is a kind of condensed stripped down version of the more traditional text, A Concise Introduction to Logic. So there's a lot of examples that they talk about in the textbook there. And I wanted to take some time and go over some of the stuff that's in there. So all of these examples will simply come from the textbook. If you have it, you can follow along. If you don't, then this will serve as a kind of introduction to what we're talking about in section, the first section of propositional logic. I believe this is 5.1. So I gave an overview of propositional logic the last time, and we introduced in that video our main logical operators: conjunction, disjunction, material implication, negation, material equivalence. So now thinking less about the symbols for a second, more about English, we use conjunction then to translate words like and, for instance, obviously. So here's a sentence: Tiffany sells jewelry and Gucci sells cologne. That's obviously going to be translated using a dot. But we would also use a dot to translate sentences involving the words also, but, however, yet, still, moreover, although, and also nevertheless. So this is not 100% always the case, that whenever you see one of these words, it's going to be truth functionally indicating conjunction, but often it will. So here's an example changing the but to and. It says Tiffany sells jewelry, but Gucci sells cologne. And again, Tiffany sells jewelry, however, Gucci sells cologne. If we have a key then taking one of our allowed symbols, a capital letter, in this case maybe T. Remember, it's arbitrary, but you may as well use T maybe to remind you what it stands for. So in this case, we would say that Tiffany sells jewelry is what T stands for. And Gucci sells cologne, we may use the letter G, and then we would symbolize all of those sentences with T dot G. So the dot there is our symbol for conjunction. And remember, other systems may have different characters. As long as they have the same truth table, they're talking about the same thing. So if it's the case that they use a caret or an ampersand or something like that, as long as they mean conjunction, and the truth tables for conjunction as they are in classical logic, then it's exactly equivalent to writing T dot G as we just did. Now notice that you need the key there to interpret it, and that in the key you need to have full sentences that express propositions. And also notice that up in those sentences, the commas, the punctuation, the semicolon, those things indicate what the main operator is. So that is Tiffany sells jewelry, comma, and then the word and right there, that's an indication that the dot is the main operator. Now, obviously, this is a very simple sentence, and maybe it's already clear that the dot is the main operator, but these things, as they get more complicated, commas and semicolons and these sorts of things become increasingly important. Now, just to illustrate one of the points I was just saying a second ago, here's another sentence from the book. It says, Tiffany and Ben Bridge sell jewelry. So this is obviously a conjunction, but you need to make sure that when you give a key, when you symbolize what's going on, that you understand that there's two propositions there. So one is that Tiffany sells jewelry, and the other is that Ben Bridge sells jewelry. So given that key, then we could represent the sentence as saying T dot B. But sometimes when I encounter students' work, what they do is they'll say T maybe stands for Tiffany sells jewelry, and then they'll say B stands for Ben Bridge. Or even worse, they'll say T stands for Tiffany and B stands for Ben Bridge. Now maybe in their own mind it's clear that those things really are another shorthand for the entire proposition that Tiffany sells jewelry. But you need to make it clear to whoever's looking that you understand that especially if it's in a class on logic. If you're just doing this at home, that's up to you. But you need to make it clear to the person who's looking at this that you understand that in propositional logic, the symbols that we're allowed to use, the capital letters, stand for full propositions, things which are true or false. And obviously the word Ben Bridge is neither true nor false. It's simply, I'm assuming, the name of a company, although honestly, I don't know. Okay, so make sure that in the key then you have that clearly noted. Okay, so we're going to do a lot of examples, but just moving on to disjunction. Disjunction we use to translate sentences involving or, as well as unless. Unless is a bit tricky, so I'll just start with the easy case first. So here again, examples from the book. It says Aspen allows snowboards, or Tellerid does. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Tellerid. Either Aspen allows snowboards or Tellerid does. So we're going to use our key and say that we have the letters A stands for Aspen allows snowboards, and we have the letter T for that Tellerid allows snowboards, and then given that, both of those sentences say A wedge T. So the thing to notice there is that in the first sentence there is no comma, whereas in the previous ones we were looking at there was a comma right before the word and or whatever, or but. And you can have the comma there, it would be fine. But in this case, since there is no ambiguity about what the main operator is, there's only one logical operator there, is the word or. So we don't need a comma indicating what it is. But in a couple of minutes, I'll show you examples where the commas really matter. The other thing to note is that the words either or, when they're paired like that, they tell you, in essence, where the parentheses go. So sometimes you will have commas telling you where parentheses in a translation will go, and sometimes you'll have other clues in the sentence. The words either or happen to be a pretty strong indicator of that. So we'll come back, I'll give you examples of that, but let's look at the examples involving unless. So in the book, we're told that when we see the word unless, we should translate it as the wedge, so that Aspen allows snowboards unless Tellerid does, according to the way we would do things, is just going to be translated as A wedge T, the very same thing that we have in the first sentence up there. But a lot of people are puzzled by that, because what they hear the sentence as really saying involves a tilde. So Aspen allows snowboards unless Tellerid does sounds to a lot of people like it's saying, well, if Tellerid doesn't allow snowboards, then Aspen does. So it sounds like it's indicating some kind of conditional statement there, and one that involves negation, that if one condition isn't met, then the other one has it. So that's in fact what a lot of people hear, and what we could show with the truth table actually is that that sentence is logically equivalent to A wedge T. You could do the truth table yourself. We're doing them in class, and if you want me to do it on the board, or if you want me to explain how the truth table shows that they're equivalent, then we can talk about that. But for now, we can just say that, in fact, those two sentences are equivalent. And so if you wrote one, it would be just as good as writing the other. There really is no difference between writing A wedge T and writing tilde T horseshoe A, other than a syntactic difference in the symbols that you've written. Given what those symbols mean, those two statements say the same thing. So the book tells you just translate it as A wedge T. I'm telling you that you can translate it like that, or as tilde T horseshoe A, and you would have get the full credit for any problems, but also they would just be logically equivalent. So here's another example from the book. It says, unless Aspen allows snowboards, Tellerid does. And the point that they're trying to make in the book is that you would translate that sentence in the same way. The word unless is there, and so you would just go A wedge T. So the book says that all of these sentences get translated as A wedge T, and that is the convention. But if you think about what unless means to, I think, a kind of typical person, the if not, the kind of construction we have under Aspen allows snowboards unless Tellerid does, then this sentence will look to many people like it says, if Aspen doesn't allow snowboards, then Tellerid does. So how do we reconcile that with what we've been saying? Well, it turns out that if you did a truth table on tilde A horseshoe T, you would see that that was logically equivalent to just A wedge T as well. So the English meaning of unless probably is captured better by the phrase if not. So where the unless is tells you where the not goes. If it's not the case that Aspen allows snowboards, then Tellerid does, is I think closer to what the meaning of unless is in English. But since it's logically equivalent to A wedge T, we are allowed to simply say, well, okay, why not just write the simpler one, A wedge T? That's really what's the essence of it is. And so that's why the convention for treating unless as a wedge arises, I would say. But it's not wrong to treat it as a conditional statement. And you would never be marked wrong on any assignment or anything like that for writing one logically equivalent expression or the other. However, we could sort of say that you might not be capturing what the person meant. So there is a question about whether a person who says one of these sentences has in mind one of these syntactic elements or the other. And that's something that I think is a very interesting question, but we can leave that for discussing in class. However, before sort of leaving the word unless, sometimes I hear people telling me that no, we're missing something in the kind of translations of unless that we have so far, because people hear it as saying more, at least in some circumstances. So here's a kind of example. Unless it rains, we will have a picnic. So many people would say, well, this sort of seems to express not only is it the case that if it doesn't rain, then we'd have a picnic, but also that if it is the case that we have the picnic, then it didn't rain. And of course, what that is a triple bar, really. And it says if and only if, and we'll talk about that in a second. But that would say that basically that sometimes unless would be equivalent to saying if and only if, which is much stronger than simply saying that something is the case only if something else is the case, because you're saying also the other thing as well. So what are we going to do here? Well, here is one of those interesting questions where you could say, okay, so maybe the word unless in English is ambiguous and has these multiple meanings as between just this kind of only if reading, or if not reading, I guess is the more technically correct way to put it. So it has this if not kind of meaning, which can be ultimately reduced to the wedge, as we have done in the book. And then other times it has this stronger meaning, meaning not just if not, but if and only if something isn't the case. And so there is a case to be made that the word unless just has these two meanings. Now, on the other hand, someone could argue back, well, no, the word unless just has the one meaning, and maybe it's the one given by the normal textbook translation for unless. And then these other things that we're building on top of it have to do more with the pragmatics, what the speaker means, what they intend to be conveying, or what they can be reasonably interpreted as intending to convey, depending on how you like to talk about pragmatics. But there's a debate that you could have about whether the word itself is semantically ambiguous, having multiple meanings, or whether it's semantically univocal, and the variance comes at the level of people interacting with the word. So I'm sure, this is a complicated issue, and I'm not trying to get you to believe one versus the other. In fact, really, the thing that I care about is just that we can use the tools of propositional logic to distinguish these kinds of translations, and then to ask questions about which of them are logically equivalent, have the same meaning truth functionally, and then further questions about, well, which one best captures the meaning of what the person was saying, because obviously they're distinct propositions. So I wouldn't be one to claim to know the answer to these kinds of questions, but I do think that the tools that we're developing can help us answer them. Okay, so let's move on just a little. Since we're talking about conditional statements, let's focus on them a little more explicitly. So the difference between if and then only if, and then finally if and only if, is somewhat confusing to people. And so I want to make sure to spend some time talking about these differences. And then finally, I want to make sure that we have some handle on how we talk about things like in case, or provided that, or given that today is Tuesday, then something else has to happen, or on condition that. So these are usually treated in the same way as if, and so we're going to have to distinguish between A if B, A only if B, A if and only if B, and I have a slide about that, but just to kind of illustrate this. So here's just a kind of typical conditional statement. It says if Purdue raises tuition, then so does Notre Dame. So if we take the letter P to stand for Purdue raises tuition, and if we take the letter N to stand for Notre Dame raises tuition, then we could symbolize, excuse me, then we can symbolize that sentence as P horseshoe N. Now, what about the sentence, Notre Dame raises tuition if Purdue does? Well, there we need to remember what the function of the word if is. So whenever you see the word if all by itself, it's going to be different with the words only if, which we treat as a unit here. But whenever you see the word if by itself, then you need to find whatever coming directly to the right of it, and that is going to be your antecedent of the conditional statement. So if you look up at the first sentence there, if Purdue raises tuition, then so does Notre Dame, and you read the word if, then directly what's to the right of that is going to be the antecedent of the conditional statement. And how you know which proposition is directly to the right of it, typically, is by following over to find the comma. And the comma comes usually before the word then, and everything in between the word if and the comma is the proposition that goes in the antecedent. So in the first sentence there, it's Purdue raises tuition. That's in between the word if and the comma. Look in the second sentence, of course we don't have a comma, we have the word if, and then something right after it, and then a period indicating there's no further elements of this sentence. And so Purdue does is the thing that's going to be the antecedent, but of course Purdue does is not a proposition. That can be true or false because it doesn't tell you what they do, but the first part of the sentence tells you that, and therefore we know that the antecedent is Purdue raises tuition. So in each case, we're following the same rule. We see the word if there, and we immediately look to the right of it to know what's going to go into the antecedent. Sometimes people are confused by this because the word if is in different locations. In one case, at the beginning of the sentence, at the other case, towards the end of it. But logically, there is no difference between these sentences, and they would all be translated as P horseshoe N. Now, confusingly, the sentence located there at the end, Purdue raises tuition only if Notre Dame does, is also translated as P horseshoe N. And that is something that people find very confusing because the if there, they were just told to translate that as going into the antecedent. But of course, that's why we say no, 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 no. The words only there in front of the if change what's happening. Really, if we're going to talk about necessary and sufficient conditions in a second, and that'll sort of try to help make sense of what's going on here. But really what that sentence says, and what I hear in my head when I read that sentence, is that if it is not the case that Notre Dame raises tuition, then it is not the case that Purdue raises tuition. That's the second set of symbols I have there, tilde N, horseshoe, tilde P. So that sentence is logically equivalent. You could do a truth table to show that it's logically equivalent. And in class, we have done those kinds of truth tables showing these kinds of statements. If you want me to talk about it, then go ahead and ask. But it's it's not too difficult to show that those two sentences have the same meaning. And so, of course, you could translate them interchangeably. If one seems more natural to you, that is fine to write it that way. But the way the book tells you to remember it is just that when you see the word only if, then put what comes after it into the consequence of the conditional statement. That's just a quick and easy way to remember what's going on here. I'll say a little bit more about this on the next slide, where I have these rules and generally spelled out. Okay, so just to wrap this up then, notice that, so what we've just distinguished was that when you see the words if, then, everything is fine. So the first sentence, you just know what's in between the word if and the comma goes in the antecedent. When you don't see the word then, things become a little trickier. And for instance, if it just says, if Purdue raises tuition, then Notre Dame does, that's the same sentence there, but with the word if. So that's a bit confusing. But you can memorize the rule. The words only if tell you that whatever follows it goes into the consequent. Okay, so we have a distinction between if and then only if. And we treat phrases like provided that as being more like if. So Cornell cuts enrollment provided that Brown does, really, according to us, says that if Brown does it, then Cornell does it. And that's what exactly would be said by this sentence as well. Cornell cuts enrollment on condition that Brown does. We treat that as saying if, rather than only if, for example. So on condition, that could be replaced by the word if. And you could have the sentence say, Cornell cuts enrollment if Brown does. And that's the way we would translate the sentence. So therefore, those two sentences get the same kind of treatment. B horseshoe C if B stands for Brown cuts enrollment and C stands for Cornell cuts enrollment. And by tradition, we also use the horseshoe to translate the word implies. I don't know why that just happened, but okay, I don't think I can go back and fix it. Let me just continue on. We also use the horseshoe to translate the word imply. So if it says that Cornell's cutting enrollment implies that Brown does, or Brown's cutting enrollment implies that Cornell's done, that's going to get translated as B horseshoe C as well. And there is a bit of a tricky thing there because the word implies is often taken to indicate a conclusion or kind of an inference is being made, and conditional statements are not inferences, are not arguments. But we do take this kind of convention where you can represent an inference as a conditional statement. And so if we play a little bit loose and fast with the word there, we can just use the horseshoe. And that is the convention, by the way. That is the way the business is done. Okay, so just generally then summing up this discussion, the difference when you see A if B, what follows the if goes into the antecedent. So that would be translated as B horseshoe A. And if you see A only if B, then what follows the only if goes in the consequent, so that would be A horseshoe B, and that's because that sentence is really saying if it's not the case that B, then it's not the case that A. And that really brings us directly to the topic of necessary and sufficient conditions. So necessary sufficient conditions are very useful for making definitions. Sometimes people have a bit trouble understanding necessary and sufficient conditions. To say that A is a sufficient condition for something is to say that that's one way of achieving it, so that if you do this, then the other thing will happen. And that sort of tells you that there's a conditional statement there, and that a sufficient condition is indicating to you that the thing that is sufficient goes into the antecedent. So if Hilton's opening a new hotel is a sufficient condition for Marriott's doing so, and if H stands for Hilton is opening a new hotel, and if M stands for Marriott is opening a new hotel, then we have the sentence above saying H horseshoe M. The sufficient condition, the thing which you're being told is a sufficient condition, goes into the antecedent. Now, on the other hand, being told that something is a necessary condition tells you that it goes into the consequent. So Hilton's opening a new hotel is a necessary condition for Marriott's doing so, is going to reverse the antecedent and consequent, and it's going to say M horseshoe H. And the reason it says M horseshoe H is because what you're being told is that this is a necessary condition. So if something is a necessary condition, it goes into the consequent, because what you're basically telling someone is that without having that thing, you don't get the first thing. And so that gives us that expression going with the tildes. So we would translate as saying M horseshoe H. And the reason we would do that is because really the sentence is telling us the transposition of that. Tilde H, horseshoe, tilde M. Which I thought I had written down here, but I see I didn't. So maybe I'll have to come back and add that. But that now brings us to talking about if and only if, which is now a third thing, a distinct thing from the words if and the words only if. It's putting them two together. And we translate that using the triple bar. So if you say JFK tightens security, if and only if O'Hare does, and if you use the letter J for JFK tightens security, and if you use the letter O for O'Hare tightens security, then we would say that sentence is translated as J triple bar O. Okay, that's what the triple bar indicates, is that it's if and only if. And that since we just talked about necessary and sufficient conditions, and a sufficient condition telling you the horseshoe goes in one direction, and a necessary condition telling you what goes in the consequent, then you can see that we would translate this the same way. So the book tells you when you see this, necessary, sufficient business, use the triple bar. It's also perfectly fine to write what the sentence would be translated if you knew what sufficient and necessary conditions were from the previous section. So if JFK's tightening security is a sufficient condition for O'Hare's doing so, then that tells you that J horseshoe O. That's because being sufficient tells you it goes into the antecedent. If JFK's tightening security is also a necessary condition for O'Hare doing it, then that tells you that the J goes in the consequent. And so what that's really telling you is you have both of these things, that J horseshoe O and also that O horseshoe J. And that's really where the if and only if comes from, because the J horseshoe O business there is from English saying J only if O. That's the way you would translate J only if O. Whereas on the other side, we get the J if O. And if you put those two things together, then you get J if and only if O. And that's what the triple bar really expresses. Okay, so at this point, I'm hoping that it's becoming clear that translating from English is a bit tricky, and it's a little bit of an art, and what it requires is to try to figure out what proposition the person who wrote the sentence was meaning to express. And if you can't figure that out, then trying to figure out what proposition the sentence on the paper is best interpreted as expressing. And sometimes that will be ambiguous, and sometimes not. But in the textbook, for instance, and any exams in the class or whatnot, the ambiguity is tried to be checked or reined in by careful use of punctuation. So in logic, punctuation indicates where the parentheses go. And parentheses are required every time there is more than one operator where the other operator is not a tilde. So you need to know what the main operator is, and if that's ever ambiguous, then parentheses are important. And so where the commas are in sentences, especially in the textbook or in anything that I write for the class, where the commas are is not accidental. They're not just sprinkled in like salt into a soup. They are importantly placed to indicate what the main operator is. So here we have a sentence, Prozac relieves depression and Allegra combats allergies, and then there's a comma and the word or. Zocor lowers cholesterol. So the comma tells you that the or is the main operator, and that the dotted expression, Prozac relieves depression and Allegra combats allergies, get grouped together on the other side of a wedge. So it tells you the final correct translation is parentheses P dot A, parentheses, wedge, Z, and that is importantly not the same as P dot open parentheses A wedge Z close parentheses. That is a different sentence with different truth values. They may be consistent with each other. They can both be true at the same time, but they don't mean the same thing. So we need to take care to really pay attention at this point to where the comma is and what that's indicating to us. For instance, if the comma had been in a different location, if it said instead that Prozac relieves depression, comma, and Allegra combats allergies or Zocor lowers cholesterol, then we would have the other translation. The parentheses would be moved over, and we would have P dot parentheses A wedge Z close parentheses, as opposed to P dot A being in a group inside parentheses. We have A wedge Z in a group inside parentheses. These two sentences are not equivalent to each other. The only difference between them is the comma. So in your own writing, when you're writing things down, you may not really be thinking about where the commas are or where they should be. But to someone who's reading your work, where the commas are usually is indicating something. It's often the case that you can use them rhetorically to indicate where a pause would be or something dramatic like that. But if you really are trying to express an argument, if you're trying to convince somebody of something, then you should be careful with where the commas are placed, because you're indicating to someone what proposition you're intending to express. And I cannot tell you how many times that I've had a kind of discussion with students where they come in and they say, what's wrong with this answer? Not in logic in particular, but just in a class in general, where they don't like the grade they got. And they say, what's wrong with this answer that I wrote? And then I explain what the correct answer is. And they say, yeah, but that's what I said. And to them, it seems as though they have expressed those propositions. But when you read what they've written, they haven't expressed those propositions. They've expressed other propositions which may be similar or related, but don't say the same thing. And oftentimes it's invisible to the student, the differences between these kinds of distinctions we're making between this proposition being true versus that one being true, and they're not meaning the same thing, even if they both happen to accidentally be true at the same time. And so paying careful attention to where the commas are and semicolons and other kinds of punctuation indicators is going to be increasingly important. So you need to start getting on board with that now. Okay, so now it's not going to always be that simple, of course. It's not always the case that simply a comma or lack of a comma indicate where the parentheses go. So sometimes there were other clues. So in this sentence here, it says either Prozac relieves depression and Allegra combats allergies, or Zocor lowers cholesterol. There are no commas there. So how are you supposed to move from that sentence to know what the correct translation of it is? And here is where the words either or become very important. And they often serve in English exclusively to indicate where parentheses ought to be placed, how to disambiguate the sentence. So the either or can be thought of as like a package, which really can just almost be directly translated into parentheses. So this sentence tells you that it's P.A, which is enclosed in parentheses, because those are the propositions which are surrounded by the either or. So either, and then there's the thing on the left side of the wedge, Prozac relieves depression, and and Allegra combats allergies. And then there's or. So that tells you that the thing in between either and or goes on one side of the wedge, and the thing on the other side of or goes on the other side of the wedge, giving us the same translation as the first sentence where there was a comma, but not the word either. So these are the things that you need to become sensitive to. Now, what about this sentence? Prozac relieves depression and either Allegra combats allergies or Zocor lowers cholesterol. Well, I hope it's clear by now that the words either or are doing the same thing there as they did in the previous sentence, but indicating the other translation. So they're indicating that the parentheses go around the A wedge Z, and it's P which gets dotted to that expression. So that now we have a conjunction as opposed to a disjunction. So in one case, the commas were indicating where the parentheses went. In the other cases, it's other words. So there isn't really strictly one rule all the time, but you need to sort of look at what the sentence says and have these general rules of thumbs in mind. Okay, so what about this one though? Prozac relieves depression, or both Allegra combats allergies and Zocor lowers cholesterol. Okay, well I hope you can see that this is really the same thing, except for now instead of indicating a disjunction, we have the package indicator for conjunction. So both Allegra combats allergies and Zocor lowers cholesterol. It's both of them. If it's both of them, then that's going to be indicating to us that it's really going to be P and then a wedge to this conjunction. So these are the sorts of signals which you need to become sensitive to. What phrases are being used? Where is the punctuation? Okay, now what about this last final sentence here, at least on this slide? There's no punctuation, there are no either or both. It simply says Prozac relieves depression and Allegra or Zocor lowers cholesterol. Well, this is a kind of typical pattern that people, at least in English, follow. So the pattern here is that where you don't want to clutter up your prose, what you're writing, with commas or words like either or, you can kind of combine the things which you want in parentheses into a kind of shortened version, all of which are connected to one predicate. So here it says Prozac relieves depression, and now we have the sentence lowering cholesterol, but we're telling Allegra or Zocor are doing that. So that's really indicating to us that what we have here is a P and then a dot to the wedged expression inside, much like the earlier. I'm not sure why it's doing that, but anyway, so it's P dot parentheses A wedge Z there, and the thing that clued us into that was that those two things, Allegra and Zocor, were combined together sort of with the lowering of cholesterol. So you'd only use that common that common noun phrase there if those things both have that property. Okay, so let's take some slightly more complicated examples. In particular, there's one kind of construction that I see people struggle with a lot, and that's when you have conditional statements that are kind of, that have more than one horseshoe operator in them. So take the sentence, if Merck changes its logo, then if Pfizer increases its sales, then Lilly will reorganize. So there's clearly two horseshoes in there. There's two occurrences of the word if. But it's kind of ambiguous between two different ways of translating it. So is the first horseshoe in parentheses or not is really one way of putting it. There's a kind of rule of thumb that we use, and whenever there's a kind of ambiguity here, what we generally do is just adopt a convention. So just like with the tilde, when we say it's not the case that A and B, that could be symbolized in two ways, and we adopt a convention that the tilde just applies to the next thing to it. So that would be tilde A dot B, not tilde parentheses A dot B. That's just one way of choosing to proceed. You could debate in particular cases about whether this is the right way, but that's the way the book, and if you have these examples given on a quiz or test or in the homework, those would be the answers. But in this case, we do something similar. So what we remember from before was that whenever we see the word if, we know that what comes after it is going to be the antecedent. And the way to know what proposition's in the antecedent is to usually follow out after the word if over to the comma. And what's in between the word if and the comma is going to be the antecedent. So in this case, it's Merrick changes its logo. That's what's in between the word if and the comma. And then on the other side, we see then. And so everything after the word then is going to be in the consequent of the horseshoe statement. And what's over there is another horseshoe statement, and we should apply the same procedure. We see the word if, follow it to the comma, and we see that in between that second if and the comma is Pfizer increases sales. So what that indicates is that the correct translation, using M for Merrick changes its logo, P for Pfizer increases sales, and L for Lilly will reorganize, then what that sentence should be symbolized as is M horseshoe, open parentheses, P horseshoe L, close parentheses. And the reason that that's correct is because the comma right there tells us that Merrick changes its logo is in the antecedent all by itself. The word then, if Pfizer increases its sales, is captured by the parentheses and the P right there, because Pfizer increases its sales is also in between a comma and the word if. Okay, so typically, whenever it goes the other way, people will use some special indicator to show that. So take the following sentence. If Merrick changing its logo implies that Pfizer increases sales, then Lilly will reorganize. So there, the word implies is translated as a horseshoe because this is clearly just one sentence, or seems clearly that way to me. And so there we have the M horseshoe P in parentheses. And the reason why is, again, exactly the same procedure was followed. We saw the word if, and then we sort of just scanned over to where we found the comma. And where we found the comma was over here, after the word sales and before the word then. And in between the if and the comma, we found the sentence, Merrick's changing its logo implies that Pfizer increases sales. And so therefore, that sentence is going to be the one that's in the antecedent of the conditional statement. That sentence, Merrick changing its logo implies Pfizer increases sales, gets translated as a horseshoe, M horseshoe P. So now we know that the antecedent is itself a conditional statement. This is almost always the way that it is. Though there are rare exceptions. I've seen rare cases where you need to translate a sentence in this kind of way with the horseshoe and the antecedent, where it's not flagged in some explicit way. But in those cases, the commas are always dead giveaways about what goes into the antecedent. So just to sort of hammer this point home about commas and antecedents, let's look at this sentence. It says, if Schering and Pfizer lower prices or Novartis downsizes, then Warner will expand production. Okay, so we see the if then, so we know this is a conditional statement. The main operator looks like a horseshoe because we follow it out from the word if, and we see this long complicated sentence, but then there's the word comma and the word then, and on the other side is just the other sentence, Warner will expand production. So if we have S for Schering lowers prices, and if we use P for Pfizer lowers prices, and N for Novartis downsizes, and W for Warner will expand, then we can see that the antecedent of this conditional statement is everything in between the if and the comma, And it's that sentence: Sharing and Pfizer lower prices or Novartis downsizes. So here again, a complicated sentence, but really you can see that it is simply employing one of those tricks that we just discussed. And the sharing and Pfizer part are conjoined and sort of being told that they lower prices. So that's telling us that S dot P go into parentheses, and there's going to be a wedge to an N over there, and that whole thing is the antecedent. So if we try to symbolize this sentence, then we would see that that whole expression has to be put into brackets. So on the left-hand side, so the main operator of the sentence, the horseshoe right there. On the right-hand side, in the consequent, we have the W, which we stand for Warner will expand production. So in the antecedent, we have that complicated expression, S dot P wedge N. But S dot P has to be in parentheses on the left-hand side of a wedge. And in our book, we're allowed to use brackets. In regular real life, you just have another set of parentheses right there. But you need some way to indicate that it's that entire thing on the left-hand side which goes into the antecedent of that conditional statement. So that's a complicated sentence, but there will be sentences like that down the road that we have to symbolize. So moving on to some other more complicated examples, we really need to keep in mind the difference between saying that not both and saying neither nor. And so I want to give some examples here. Here's another one. Remember, all these are from the book. I'm not writing these examples. These are just taken from the Hurley textbook. So here we have a sentence that says, Megan is not a winner, but Kathy is. So if we have M standing for the sentence, Megan is a winner, and if we have K standing for the sentence, Kathy is a winner, then we would translate that sentence using a tilde M for it's not the case that Megan isn't a winner, and K for claiming that Kathy is. So in this case, notice again that the comma right there is indicating that Megan is not a winner is one unit, that the tilde applies to M only. So we don't need to adopt our convention in this case. Let's look at another sentence, though. Not both Megan and Kathy are winners. Now, whenever you see not both, then you need to translate that using a tilde to capture the word not. But you need to say that both of them are not. So it's not the case that M dot K. This would be incorrectly translated as tilde M dot tilde K. Although we'll find out in a second that you could translate it as tilde M wedge tilde K. So it's not both of them. It's one or the other of them. That's not the case. Okay, so now that's different from saying that either or is not. So in this case, we really are saying the more wedge version of this sentence, that either tilde M or tilde K. So either Megan is not a winner or Kathy is not a winner. It turns out that these two sentences here, tilde parentheses M dot K and tilde M wedge tilde K, are logically equivalent. So this is sometimes referred to as De Morgan's rule. That's certainly what our book uses to refer to it, because it was shown by Augustus De Morgan here. But you could do a truth table on these two sentences and see that they in fact have the same meaning. And so if you want the upshot of this, if you want to take a tilde and put it into a parentheses, then that changes what's inside into a wedge. And the same also holds the other direction. So if you say that both Megan and Kathy are not winners, then the way that we would translate that is saying it's not the case that Kathy is a winner, and it's also not the case that Megan is a winner. They are both not winners. That's the way the both not version works. So if you wanted to have the tilde in front of a parentheses with a wedge inside, then that's not either. So not either Megan or Kathy is a winner gets translated as tilde parentheses M wedge K. Now, just as before, those bottom two sentences are logically equivalent, and the top two sentences are logically equivalent. Excuse me, not the very top sentence, tilde M dot K. That's logically equivalent to tilde parentheses M wedge tilde K. That's a different story, which we may talk about in class or at a later time in the videos. At this point, though, what we're trying to impress on ourselves is that there's one thing about how the truth tables tell us about the meanings of these things and which sets of symbols are logically equivalent, have the same meaning according to truth table interpretation, at least, with other sets of symbols. But there's also the question of capturing what's written in the English. So if you saw the sentence, not either Megan or Kathy is a winner, and if you translate it as tilde m dot tilde k, then that is logically correct. You have captured the truth functional meaning of the sentence. But what the person said was not either. And if you wanted to somehow preserve the fact that they had said the word either or, then you would want the wedge. And so even though those two translations are logically equivalent, in some cases, one may be more appropriate given what the person you're trying to understand has actually said or written. But just also in general, keep in mind that as with a lot of this stuff, I would accept either of those answers. If it's logically equivalent to the correct answer, then I consider it to be the correct answer, unless I have specifically said what is the most reasonable way to capture what this person has said or something like that. And even then, I don't know if it's not reasonable to use the tilde m dot tilde k. So there's a lot of leeway when it comes to translating. The focus should not be so much on worrying about what the correct translation is, but on trying to understand what the sentence is saying, what proposition is being expressed by the sentence, and how you could capture that in truth functional terms. Okay, so the general rule then, I'm sorry. Okay, so what about neither nor? So neither nor is treated in much the same way. Oops, that would be a tilde parentheses and wedge K. I really don't enjoy that it does that. But neither nor is neither nor, so that's the same as some of the previous things that I was saying. I may come back and have to try to fix that. Oh, brother. Okay, so but what are the general kinds of takeaway messages from this, just as before with the ifs and only ifs and so forth? We can do the same thing here. So when you see not either A or B, then you should take it literally as saying it's not the case that either A or B, and that's telling you that it's tilde parentheses A wedge B. Now that's logically equivalent to tilde A dot tilde B, but it's more perspicuous in a lot of cases to represent the either or. So just sort of keep that in mind as a general conventional rule. Now that's different than either not A or not B, which says that the tilde isn't the main operator. The wedge is the main operator of that sentence. It says it's either not A or it's not B. So that's an easy way to try to keep those distinct. And the same pattern holds for not both. If it says not both, then that means not both. It means it's not the case that parentheses A dot B. It's not both of those. And we know that that's logically equivalent to saying it's either not A or not B. So those two and the inside there are equivalent. But if it says both, you may as well keep the dot there. And that's different, finally, from saying both not A and not B, which says the tilde A and tilde B. So the dot there is the main operator. So these are kind of rules of thumb which you can memorize that will help you as you do translations, as we work our way into more complicated translations. Okay, so I think now we should probably do some practice. And the practice comes generally from the book. My policy is to put online only the ones that the book has the answers to. And then in classwork and for quizzes and other things like that, we use the ones that the book does not provide the answer to. So even so, though, I think that explaining why the correct answers are the way that they are is useful. So the first one is fairly basic. It says Cartier does not make cheap watches. So we have to remember the convention that we never take the not into our basic capital letter propositions. So we'd have to use C to stand for Cartier does make cheap watches. And then if we did that, we could represent that sentence as saying tilde C. So I hope that's not a surprise to anyone. Also not a surprise, both Harvard and Baylor have medical schools. Now in this case, you would need to say that H stands for Harvard has a medical school, and B stands for Baylor has a medical school. And if you did that, then you could say that this sentence says H dot B. So I don't think that those are surprising. Okay. So what about Maureen Dowd writes incisive editorials if and only if Paul Krugman does? Well, this one's a dead giveaway. You see both if and only if there, indicating the presence of a triple bar. So if you use H to be Maureen Dowd writes incisive editorials, I don't know why I used H. I think that's a typo when I was typing this, but whatever. It could be H, doesn't matter. And if you use P for Paul Krugman writes incisive editorials, then that sentence above says H triple bar P. I probably should have used M to make the convention more in line with what the book has been doing, but typo notwithstanding, that's a good translation, as long as the key specifies what H stands for. So what about the sentence, the Packers winning most of their games implies that Aaron Rodgers is a great quarterback? Well, there again, we see the word implies. So this is best represented as telling us that there's a horseshoe here, because otherwise the person would say something that looks invalid. And so this just looks like a basic sentence. If you use P, it stands for Packers winning most of their Packers win most of their games. And A stands for Aaron Rodgers is a great quarterback, then this simply says P horseshoe A. Okay, so that's just remembering that the word implies is often treated as a horseshoe, not as a conclusion indicator. Okay, so let's look at a little more of a challenge, not much of one, but a little bit. So remember, I'm not writing these examples. I don't know who Mariah Carey is or who Elton John is, but you know, I hear that maybe they are pop singers or rock singers. So it says Mariah Carey sings pop and either Elton John sings rock or Diana Krall sings jazz. Okay, so we look at that sentence. We see the and, we see the or. We know that there's conjunction, there's disjunction going on here. There are no commas. So we have to rely on something other than the commas in the sentence to tell us how correctly to place the parentheses. And in this case, hopefully by now you're already thinking in your head what the answer should be after having gone through all this. We see that Mariah Carey sings pop is followed right afterwards by the word and. So there's the dot, and then right after that is either and or. So on the other side of the dot is going to be a wedge, and it's going to be in parentheses. That's what the construction of the sentence is telling us. And so if we take M to stand for Mariah Carey, and E to stand for Elton, excuse, not Mariah Carey. Mariah Carey sings pop, and if we take E to stand for Elton John sings rock, and if we take D to stand for Diana Krall sings jazz, then we have the sentence saying M dot parentheses E wedge D close parentheses. So again, applying some of these things that we just went over, that's what this example is just checking to see if you internalized. By the way, before moving on to the next one, of course I know who Mariah Carey is. I would not fail to know who Mimi is. Give me a break. Okay, so what about this sentence? Both the Jaguar and Porsche do not make motorcycles. Okay, so now we have this both do not kind of expression, and so we have to figure out what the right way to symbolize it is. And if they both don't do something, then it is not the case that Jaguar makes them, and it's also not the case that Porsche makes them, indicating that this is the tilde J dot tilde P. But it also would have been perfectly fine to write that it's not the case that J wedge P, as long as J wedge P is in parentheses, because that says the same thing. So you can interpret that as saying neither Jaguar nor Porsche makes it if you translated it using the wedge. But the more obvious thing to do is to use the dot because the word and is there. So that's what they're trying to check you on there. Now, of course, I just gave this away. Neither nor is going to say the same thing because logically saying that both don't do something and that neither this nor that do something tell you the same amount of information, but you might want to represent them differently if you're trying to capture the fact that one uses the word neither and the other uses the word both. So in this case, the tilde parentheses F wedge M seems like the more appropriate choice given that the words neither are there, although it would not have been wrong to write tilde F dot tilde M as an alternative translation for that last sentence right there. Okay, so let's move on to some slightly, excuse me, my allergies are acting up here in the northeast. Move on to some slightly more challenging practice examples. Okay, So here we have a sentence. If Bill O'Reilly's spinning the news implies that Chris Matthews fights back, then Rachel Maddow tells it straight. Okay, so here's a sentence for you. Now we would look at this and want to first of all notice that the words if are there and then. So we would apply our strategy of looking for what the antecedent is by following the word if over to the right and finding if there's a comma there. In this case, there is a comma right where we would expect it, right before the word then. And in between the words if and then is the sentence, Bill O'Reilly spinning the news implies that Chris Matthews fights back. And that tells us that that whole sentence goes into the antecedent. So now to pick some letters, and also to recognize that the word implies right there is telling us there's a horseshoe in the antecedent. So this is going to have two horseshoes in it. The first horseshoe is going to be in parentheses. All this we can get just from looking at the commas and noticing the words that are there. So if we use B for Bill O'Reilly spins the news, and C for Chris Matthews fights back, and R for Rachel Maddow tells it straight, then what the grammar up there is telling us is that this is B horseshoe C, which is in parentheses and connected by a horseshoe to R. Everything on the left over there in parentheses is everything that comes before the comma and after the word if in the sentence. Just applying straightforwardly the principles that we were talking about previously. Okay, so here's another example. It says either Rado does not make a sapphire watch, or if Movado makes one, then so does Pulsar. Okay, so now here, again, no commas, so we have to look for some alternative way to know what the structure of the sentence is. And obviously here it's the words either or. So we see the words either or, we see not, we see if, so we have a bunch of stuff. We have tildes, we have wedges, we have horseshoes. But what's the correct structure? Well, either or tells us a package is in place, and therefore that's marking where the wedge goes. And on the one side of the wedge, we have Rado does not make a sapphire watch, which I guess we could call tilde R. And then there's going to be a wedge, and on the other side of the wedge is going to be the if-then statement, and there's no comma over there because you don't really need one. We just know that this on the other side over there, there's the sentence, Movado makes a sapphire watch, and also Pulsar makes a sapphire watch. And what that tells us is that we should symbolize this sentence as tilde R wedge, open parentheses, M horseshoe P, close parentheses. And we knew that because the either or was telling us that the main operator there is that wedge, it's the or. And on one side of it is a tilde R, and on the other side of it is an M horseshoe P. So again, not always going to be relying on commas. Other times there are other syntactic or semantic indicators on where these things go. Okay, so now checking again, see if you recall some of the stuff we were previously discussing. If we have a sentence like Mercury is a planet, given that both Pluto and Ceres are not, then we need to first understand that the both are not part over there, and the second, what the given that is doing. So you may recall that given that and these other kinds of words like provided that and condition that are taken to sort of function like the word if, indicating that that there's a conditional statement first of all, and that what's to the right of it is in the antecedent. So Mercury is a planet, given that both Pluto and Ceres are not, indicates that both Pluto and Ceres are not planets is going to be in the antecedent of a conditional statement. And we know what the both are not looks like. It's tildes and a dot. So what the ultimate sentence looks like then, using the kind of obvious letters P, C, and M, stand for Pluto is a planet, Ceres is a planet, Mercury is a planet, in the antecedent is tilde P dot tilde C. And the reason that tilde P dot tilde C is in the antecedent is because it says both Ceres and Pluto are not planets. That's both of them are not. That's different than not both. Both not is different. So that tells us this. Now, of course, you could have just written tilde parentheses P wedge C, close parentheses horseshoe M. That would have been logically equivalent, also acceptable. But given that it says both not there, this is sort of the more obvious translation to go for. But this is tricky because it requires you to put together several of the things that we've been discussing. And that's in general the way that these problems and quizzes, things that we give in class and homework assignments, etc., they're checking to see whether you've read very carefully what the book has said and really understood it, because it's all just giving you different instances of the kinds of principles developed in the translation section. So, for example, take this sentence. Tiffany and Benbridge will release an emerald collection unless Zales and Kale do not. Okay, so here's a pretty complicated sentence, but you could just use some of the principles we developed to simplify it. The unless there seems to be indicating the main operator. And on one side, we have Tiffany and Benbridge will release an emerald collection, and that's a conjunction using T.B. Tiffany releases an emerald collection. Benbridge releases an emerald collection. And on the other side, we have the Zales and Kale do not release an emerald collection. And so the main operator of this is the wedge. And on the one side, we have the T.B, as we explained. And on the other side, we have the tilde Z dot tilde K, because it is saying that both of them don't do this. Now, of course, you could have put the tilde out in the wedge inside the parentheses. That would have been fine. And of course, you could have taken a tilde and a horseshoe, this sentence to indicate that a tilde parentheses, tilde Z dot tilde K, close parentheses, horseshoe, T.B in parentheses, would have been another way of doing it. But the way the book recommends, and the way usually people proceed, to be honest, is to treat unless as the wedge. And this would indicate then this kind of construction. Okay, so now remember, this is a pretty complicated sentence, but sometimes we say things like this and we want to understand the conditions under which it would be true. And the rules that we have developed can help us understand that. Okay, so what about this sentence? It says, Barack Obama emphasizes peaceful negotiation, semicolon, but if North Korea starts a war, then either China or Japan will be involved. Okay, so we know how to do this. We pick our letters. So B, Barack Obama emphasizes peaceful negotiation. N, North Korea starts a war. C, China is involved in the war. J, Japan is involved in the war. That North Korea started, I guess you'd have to actually add to make it fully correct. But what is the structure of the sentence? Well, the semicolon there is telling us pretty clearly where the main operator is. And on one side of it, we just have the sentence, Barack Obama emphasizes peaceful negotiation. On the other side, we have the word but, and we know that that indicates a dot, or the word and. And then after that, we have the conditional statement. If North Korea starts a war, comma, then either China or Japan will be involved. So we know how to deal with that. We look for the word if, we follow for the comma, we see in between North Korea starts a war. So what this is telling us basically is that we should have B dot and then a parentheses, and we have N horseshoe, and then on the other side we apply our either or strategy, and that tells us that in parentheses over there C wedge J, and therefore we need to enclose that whole right hand conjunct in brackets or another set of parentheses depending on how you do things. In our book, we use brackets, and then after that, curly braces, but that's just for our book. But ultimately, this is just a conjunction. It just says, phi dot psi, where the phi term is B, and the psi term is that conditional statement, N horseshoe parentheses, C wedge J, close parentheses. So that's a fairly complicated sentence, but it was built up just from the components that we understand how to deal with, looking where the semicolon is, knowing how to treat the word but as conjunction, looking at the conditional statement, knowing how to find the antecedent, and then knowing the trick for either or, telling us what goes in the consequent. So no matter how complicated the sentence is, if it's truth functional in nature, then we can kind of build up its components using these tricks. It won't always be this easy. Obviously, these sentences are written in order to be easily decipherable, and not all English sentences are. But I hope it does give you some understanding or awareness of, in your own writing and thinking, whether or not you really are paying attention in a careful way to what it is you're trying to say, and whether or not what it is you're writing or saying actually expresses the thing that you mean it to. Now, if you just say look out or give a warning, it's not as difficult, one might think. But if you're trying to give an argument or say something which is you think true, then these kinds of things really matter, because someone else may misunderstand what you were saying and therefore disagree with you. Okay, but let's look at this complicated sentence down here. says, if Monsanto poisons the entire human race, okay, then if Nestle buries us in bottles, then Smithfield and Tyson load us up with antibiotics. All right, so that's an interesting sentence. But even so, it's a complicated sentence, but we can apply the sort of strategies that we've been using to suss out its structure. So we see the word if, so we just become robots and say, where's the comma? In this case, there's the comma, and it's in between it is Monsanto poisons the entire human race. So that looks like we're just going to use M to stand for Monsanto poisons the entire human race. And so that we're going to have M horseshoe something, which is what that first part of the sentence is telling us with the comma. And on the other side then is the word then. And, well, we see another conditional statement. So we know how to deal with that. We have M horseshoe, and now we're going to have a parentheses, and there's going to be another horseshoe over there because that's what the word if is telling us. And we do the same thing. We become robots, we look for the comma. Aha, there's the comma. It's right after bottles, before then, and in between is Nestle buries us in bottles. So we know that now N is going to be the antecedent of the second conditional statement. And in the consequent is this Smith and Tyson load us up with antibiotics, which looks like a conjunction. So this is going to say M horseshoe, and then there's going to be brackets, and N horseshoe parentheses, S dot T, close parentheses, close brackets. And notice that we built that up just by noticing where the comma was, applying the strategies that we developed. Nothing essentially new, just more complicated iterations of these simple things that we had already grown to know and love. Okay, so continuing on doing some practice, I'm getting into the more and more complicated ones. And we'll only have a few more to go, but I think it's good to do as many examples as we can. Of course, we'll do more in the class, and if you have any questions about what I'm saying, feel free to ask them. But let's take this sentence here. It is not the case that both Kobe Bryant or Shaquille O'Neal plays professional tennis, and Calvin Johnson or Matt Ryan plays professional basketball. Okay, so I don't really know what the joke is supposed to be here, but one assumes that Kobe Bryant and Shaq don't play tennis. So that seems hilarious to say that they would, I guess. Is that the joke? Okay. Well, anyway, so here's some sentence structure that we can try to determine. This one is a bit tricky because you have to be very careful, and they're really checking to determine whether or not you internalize this notion about commas. Because we look here and we see, well, gee, there are no commas here. And in particular, most tellingly, what we notice is that there's no comma after the word tennis. So it is not the case that both Kobe Bryant or Shaquille O'Neal plays professional tennis and Calvin Johnson or Matt Ryan plays professional basketball. If the dot were the main operator of this sentence, we would really expect there to be a comma there. And if this were written by just some average person, we might be confused by this because there's no comma. But given that this is written by the textbook and that they have paid very close attention to these sorts of things, that indicates to us that the dot is not the main operator of this sentence. Otherwise, there would be a comma there. So what is the main operator? Well, if it's not the dot, there's only one other option, and that seems to be the tilde. It is not the case that both. So it's starting to look like what we have here is a tilde, and then inside some kind of brackets or parentheses or something is going to be a conjunction. So this looks like a not both tilde parentheses and a dot inside. So what is the conjunction? Well, there's got to be a phi and a psi, a lowercase p and a lowercase q. And inside we see it is not the case that both Kobe O'Brien or Shaquille O'Neal plays professional tennis. So that looks to me like K wedge S, where K and S stand for the obvious things. Kobe Bryant plays professional tennis. Shaquille O'Neal plays professional tennis. So that looks K wedge S on one side. And on the other side, it looks like C wedge M. C for Calvin Johnson or Matt Ryan. C for Calvin Johnson plays professional basketball, and M for Matt Ryan plays professional basketball. So that what we have here is this bracketed expression, which is governed by the tilde. It's a dot inside. And on the left side of the dot, we have the expression K wedge S. And on the right side of the dot, we have the expression K wedge M. C wedge M, I'm sorry, C wedge M. Now, to get at this, many people might think that this says something else. It is not the case that both Kobe O'Brien or Shaquille O'Neal plays tennis. Um, you may think that that somehow is interpreted differently, but the lack of the comma there really indicates that there's no other way of translating this, at least given the conventions we've adopted in the textbook. Okay, so here's another sentence from the textbook. Israel's abandoning excuse me, I can't read today. Israel's abandoning its settlements is a sufficient and necessary condition for the Palestinians declaring an end to hostilities. Okay, so controversial statement there, but we can ignore the content and try to translate it structurally. And necessary and sufficient tells us triple bar. So that's pretty straightforward, that this should be I triple bar P, where I stands for Israel abandons its settlements, and P stands for Palestine declares an end to hostilities. Now, of course, you could have also translated that as I horseshoe P in parentheses with a dot, and then another set of parentheses and P horseshoe I. So again, if it's logically equivalent, I will accept either way. Okay, so here's a good one. It is not the case that both Walmart's jeopardizing worker safety implies that Target does, and Costco's treating workers decently implies that Kmart does. Okay, so again, this is one of those sentences where if there were a comma, we would treat it differently. So after Target does, if there were a comma, we would think the dot was the main operator. But this is sort of like the first example, it looks like, where it is not the case that both, except for instead of wedges inside, it looks like horseshoes because of the words implies right there. So Walmart jeopardizing worker safety implies that Target jeopardizes worker safety, looks like W horseshoe T, and that's going to be in a dot with Costco treating workers decently implies that Kmart does, which is another horseshoe, and that's all governed by the tilde. So tilde bracket, parentheses, W horseshoe T, close parentheses, dot, open parentheses, C horseshoe K, close parentheses, close bracket. So again, the lack of the comma really indicating that the tilde is the main operator and not the dot. Okay, so you have to pay attention to those sorts of things. Okay, so building up again to some more complicated examples. Here we go. If Christina Aguilera singing Soul and Justin Timberlake singing Pop are sufficient and necessary conditions for Kelly Clarkson singing Rock, then neither Beyonce nor Shakira will sing rap. Okay. Remember, I don't write these sentences. They come from the book. But nonetheless, we can look at this. It's a complicated sentence. I don't know why you would want to say this, but you can see that the word if there, we want to use our conventions. We see the word if. We want to just scan till we find a comma. In fact, there's the comma. After Kelly Clarkson singing Rock, comma, then. So we know that everything in between goes in the antecedent of this conditional statement, which now it's looking like that's the main operator. And on the other side is this neither nor statement. So that looks like C dot J in parentheses connected by a triple bar to K, and that whole thing is in brackets, and then there's a horseshoe, and then tilde parentheses B wedge S. So once again, this is a very complicated sentence, at first seeming very difficult to translate, but if you just break it down step by step using the kind of techniques that we have been talking about, then its structure becomes fairly apparent. I wouldn't want to say obvious or anything like that. Okay, so let's just do one more set of examples. These are sort of more difficult examples, I guess, in the sense that they're kind of non-standard in a way. So here we see that the word unless comes first. Unless we reduce the incidence of child abuse, future crime rates will increase. But we treat that the same way. So the book just says if you see the word unless, then you know that there's a wedge. So this should just be R wedge F, where R stands for reduce the indulgence of child abuse, and F stands for future crime rates increase. So notice, though, that we don't have tildes here, and this sometimes confuses students because reduce the incidence of child abuse is something that sounds to some people like it's negation. We don't want to increase the incidence of child abuse. And yeah, so if you took I and say tilde I, where tilde I means not increase, unless we don't increase the incidence, then you might say, okay, well, does that mean the same thing? Well, it's not clear that it does, because you can not increase it without also reducing it. So you would have to do some other fiddling around to get the idea that you don't merely keep it at the same level but want to bring it down. But the more important point is that we want our capital letters to stand for propositions which are true or false, and that are basic in a sense, that don't involve other logical operators or constituent parts. And we reduce the incidence of child abuse is a kind of sentence like that. It simply says that there's something that we're going to do, and the same with the other case. So it's future crime rates will increase. Yeah, so we're not saying anything suspicious here. We don't need any kind of tildes to indicate that there's a decreasing of something, which I think sometimes people get confused about. If you're not confused about it, ignore whatever I said. If you are still confused about it, feel free to ask a question. So what about this? Cigarette manufacturers are neither honest nor socially responsible. Well, this is very similar to ones we've been looking at. The difference is that the neither nor there is placed after the copula, after the word are. So cigarette manufacturers are neither honest nor socially responsible. It's kind of backwards to the way that we've been seeing a lot of these examples already been given. And this just is sort of another way that English speakers sort of take shortcuts, and they don't want to say cigarette manufacturers are not honest, and also cigarette manufacturers are not socially responsible, which is what that sentence is logically equivalent to. Take the shortcut and say, well, these guys have neither of these properties. But really, the sentence has to be characterized in this more full manner, where we take H and S and represent them as indicating separate propositions. It also would not have been wrong to represent this as tilde H dot tilde S, which, as we've already said, indicates the same truth functions, therefore the same truth conditions, therefore the same meaning from the point of view of propositional logic. What? So we should apply here the same kind of ideas that we had before. So the necessary condition for a successful business venture is good planning. So if we have G represent good planning and S representing a successful business venture, then what this says is that if you have a successful business venture, then you had good planning. So that the necessary condition goes into the consequent. Excuse me. So this is just the same as before. The kind of curveball here is the construction in English. So it says a necessary condition for, and then it says the thing, and then it says is good planning. So you have to sort of just know that in English, this is telling you that it's the good planning part, which is the necessary condition. We're allowed to write it that way. So what about if affirmative action programs are dropped, then if new programs are not created, then minority applicants will suffer? Well, I think that we see what this one does. The only thing that's different here is that in the antecedent of the second conditional, there's the negation there. So, but it's the same as before. You find the if, you look for the comma. We know affirmative action programs are dropped, goes into the antecedent. And we know we don't need a tilde there because there's no negation. It says they are dropped, so that's an affirmative statement. But in the next part, after the comma, it says if new programs are not created. So there we see the tilde, and we need to include that negation in our second antecedent. So this one's a bit tricky because the dropped part, again, some people want to put a tilde there. There is no tilde. Semantically, the word has a meaning about it not rising or something like that, or falling, but that's not a negation in the way we have defined it. Okay, so let's take another sentence here. We're nearing the end. It says, cooling a group of atoms to absolute zero and keeping them bunched together is a necessary and sufficient condition for producing a Bose-Einstein condensate. So here again, we see the necessary and sufficient condition stuff. And so we know what that indicates to us. That's a triple bar. On the one side is that we produce a Bose-Einstein condensate. And on the other side is this conjunction. so that we cool a group of atoms to absolute zero and also keep them bunched together. And so that indicates that we have a C.K, cool and keep, and that there's a triple bar to the producing of the Bose-Einstein condensate. Okay, so what about this final sentence here? It says 3 strikes laws will be enforced and longer sentences imposed only if hundreds of new prisons are built. And that will happen only if taxes are increased. So this is a kind of sentence that I see a lot of people having trouble with when they are first starting. And this is that last conjunct there, and that will happen. So what is the that referring to here? Is something that people really find confusing, and often they take it to be referring back to the entire conditional statement which was coming before. So notice it says 3 strikes laws will be enforced and longer sentence imposed only if hundreds of new prisons are built. So the only if tells us that right before the comma there's a horseshoe. And so 3 strikes laws will be enforced, we could use T, longer sentences imposed, L. So that looks like in parentheses T.L, and then a horseshoe to new prisons, or hundreds of new prisons are built, so that looks like H. So parentheses T.L, close parentheses horseshoe H, dot H horseshoe I is the correct way to translate that. And notice that this is how I wrote it here, but with the bracket. So on the left hand, so the main operator is the dot right there, and it's because we see that the comma is telling us where the main operator is, and then after it comes the and. So that's why the dot becomes the main operator. So on the left side of the conjunct, we have the sentences T.L horseshoe H. So 3 strikes laws will be enforced and longer sentences imposed only if hundreds of new prisons are built. That's the way you represent that. And then on the right-hand side, another conditional statement. And that will happen only if taxes are increased. Well, what will happen? Well, hundreds of new prisons will be built only if taxes are increased. So sometimes people want to put over there, they just get rid of the dot and try to put a horseshoe as the main operator and then I on the other end. That ignores the comma and the word and right there. That's not the correct way to translate this sentence. Truth functionally, they are going to come out different as well. So we want to pay attention. If we say this in normal English, people never kind of misunderstand it in this way. So if I say to you, if you don't leave now, you'll be late for work. And if that happens, you won't get paid. So and if that happens, it's clearly talking about if you're late to work. It's not talking about the whole conditional statement. If you don't leave now, then you'll be late to work. And if that happens, and if you don't leave now, then you'll be late to work, then you won't get paid. Well, that doesn't make sense of what it is that I'm trying to say. So in this case, you sort of just have to adopt, if you don't see that in the English, if the sort of intuition isn't there with you, then you just need to sort of adopt the convention that we have in the class. And that's that whenever you see this kind of construction, and if that happens, and that happens only if, or stuff like that, what's being referred to or referenced back to is the consequence of the previous conditional statement. It's always just the consequence of the previous conditional statement. So that's just something that you have to learn how to apply if it doesn't seem natural to you. So, okay, here's our final example. It says, if banks charge fees for teller-assisted transactions, then more people will use ATMs. And if that happens and ATM fees are increased, then banks will close branches and profits will skyrocket. Okay, so this is going to be a prime example of the kind of thing we're just talking about. So let's just parse it out. It says, if banks charge fees for teller-assisted transactions, then more people will use ATMs. So using B for banks charge fees for teller-assisted transactions, and M for more people use ATMs, then that's B horseshoe M. And there's a semicolon and the word and, so we know there's a dot right there. And then it's if that happens. Okay, if what happens? Well, as we were just saying, if more people use ATMs and ATM fees increase, then banks will close branches and profits will skyrocket. So here is the translation. Just as we said, there's a dot as the main operator. On the left-hand side is our B horseshoe M statement. On the right-hand side, notice it's M dot I, where I stands for ATM fee increase. M dot I says that more people use ATMs and ATM fees increase. And if that's the case, then banks will close branches and profits will skyrocket. That's C dot P. So notice this is the same rule as before. The and if that happens refers just to the consequent of the previous conditional statement. And then in this case, it says, and also something else will happen, and that's the antecedent here. And you know that's all in the antecedent because there's the comma after ATM fees increase. And on the other side of it, it's banks will close and profits will skyrocket. That's how you know that on the other side is C dot P. So following these simple rules can really help in translating English into propositional logic.